Hi there, Alex here at mixedlessons.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to get the following drum sound using just one microphone. For a lot of us working in home studios or project studios, we may only have one microphone in our collection, and we may only have one or two channels on our interface. But we still want to record drums, and so not having the ability to do a 16-track recording of a drum kit shouldn't hold us back from recording drums. And so in this video, I'll explain to you how to get a great sounding drum recording using just one microphone. We'll go through what kind of microphone to use and where to place that microphone. We'll have a look at applying EQ and compression and reverb to that recording. And I'll also give you 3 tips that I think will help you to get the very best results that you can when you record drums this way. So first and foremost, let's start by having a listen to this drum recording without any of the plugins, without the EQ, without the compression, without the reverb, just the raw original recording of this drum kit using just one microphone. So as you can hear there, we've got a balanced sound from each part of the drum kit. And that's kind of the goal when you record drums this way. You're kind of looking to achieve 2 things. You want a balanced level from each part of the kit. So you don't want the ride cymbal to be overpowering the recording and the kick drum to be lost, for example. And you also want to balance the direct sound coming from the kit with the sound of the room. So that's kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for that balanced level of each part of the kit and a balanced level of direct sound from the drum kit to the sound of the room. Now, we'll talk in a moment about where to place the microphone, but first and foremost, let's talk about which microphone I would advise that you use to make this kind of recording. So if you're only ever going to invest in one microphone, if you only have one microphone in your studio, I would recommend that you get a large diaphragm cardioid condenser microphone. That's the kind of microphone that I advise that you use to make this recording, but it's also an ideal microphone for recording vocals, acoustic guitar, electric guitar amps. You can record a bass amp with it, piano. It's a great all-round mic. And so if you're only ever going to have one microphone in your studio, I advise that you get a large diaphragm cardioid condenser. Now, why do I advise this kind of mic? Well, of all of the different types of mic that you have, condenser, dynamic, ribbon, and so on, condenser microphones tend to capture the broadest range of frequencies, and they're also very sensitive. So they are kind of the ideal microphone in a lot of recording situations. Now, you can get large diaphragm and small diaphragm versions. The small diaphragm versions tend to be a bit brighter, so I recommend a large diaphragm to kind of capture the broadest range of frequencies. And then cardioid refers to the pickup pattern. So with a cardioid pickup pattern, the microphone is most sensitive to sounds in front of it and less sensitive to sounds at the sides and at the back. And so what that allows you to do is it allows you to kind of direct where you want the microphone to pick up sound from. And so that's really useful for when it comes to getting a balanced sound from the drums and for balancing the sound of the drums and the room. Okay, so let's talk about where to place this microphone. So this is an over-the-shoulder technique. So what you do is you place the microphone over the drummer's right shoulder. So assuming that they are a right-handed drummer, you place the microphone over the right shoulder. If they were a left-handed drummer, you would place the microphone over their left shoulder, and the microphone is looking into the drum kit. So I had this angled towards the snare drum. And so this is a great technique for getting an overall picture of the drum kit. Now, as I say, you're looking to place the mic at a position where you're getting a balanced sound from the drum kit and you're balancing that with the sound of the room. So the further back you move the microphone, the more roomy the sound will become and you'll pick up more of the room. And then the closer you move the mic, the more you'll get of the direct sound, the more drum kit that you'll get. But if you get too close, you can find that you kind of start to zone in on particular parts of the kit, and you might find that maybe the snare drum becomes a little bit overpowering. And so you're looking for that point where you're getting that balance, where you're getting the full picture of the drum kit and also balancing that with the sound of the room. Now, what you'll also find with this mic technique is that the higher up you move the microphone, the more roomy the sound will get, and you'll start to lose some of the low end. And then the lower down you move the microphone, the more of the low end that you'll get. And so again, that can be a way of balancing things. If you're not getting enough of the kick drum, for example, you can move the microphone down a little bit and it'll pick up more of the low end. And so if you're going to record drums with just one microphone, my advice is that you record with the over-the-shoulder technique. Okay, now let's have a look at applying some EQ and some compression and some reverb to this drum recording. Okay, so let's start with the EQ. So I'm using two EQs, and they're both these Pultec style EQs, but you could use any EQ. I particularly like these when I'm working on a drum recording, which is just one track of drum kit, because they're quite musical, they're quite natural sounding, and you can kind of push and pull frequencies and kind of play one frequency off against another a little bit. But you could do this with any EQ, and what I'll do is I'll give you the kind of overall goals that I'm looking to achieve when I'm EQing a single drum track, so that you can put this into practice regardless of what EQ it is you're using. So the first thing that I've done is I have applied a boost at 60 Hertz. The intention there is to bring a little bit more punch forward in the kick drum. Now, an interesting thing that you can do with this EQ is you can boost and attenuate at the same frequency. And so I've boosted at 60 Hertz, but I've also cut at 60 Hertz as well. Now, the reason that I've done that is that in adding that punch to the kick drum, because we're just working with a single track, it made some of the low frequencies a little bit kind of muddy and a little bit woolly. That's just the knock-on effect of EQing in one area. It's going to affect everything in the recording. So I'll play you that. I'll take this other EQ out for now. Actually, we'll start with both of these at 0, and I'll add the boost in and the cut, and you can hear why I've done that. So you can hear that that gives us a little bit more punch from the kick drum, but things have got maybe a little bit woolly. So now let's bring the attenuation in. So that just cleans things back up a little bit. Now, in general, I think that the drums are still a little bit woolly, and so that's why I've used this second EQ, and I'm only using one of the bands here. It's this dip option, and what I'm doing there is I'm attenuating at 200 Hertz. So we'll take that out, and again, I'll add it back in, and you can hear why I've done that. So between those two EQs, what we're getting in the low end is a little bit more punch out of the kick drum, and we're taking away some of that kind of muddiness and woolliness that we've got as a result of boosting some of the frequencies in the low end. The next thing that I've done is I've boosted at 4K. The reason I've done that is to make the snare drum pop out a little bit more. I've used a fairly sharp bandwidth to do that, and so again, we'll turn this down and then we'll turn it back up, and you'll be able to hear why I've done that. So it just gives the snare drum a little bit more crack, perhaps. And then in the final band on this EQ, I have applied a shelf. And so I'm turning down everything above 10K. The reason that I'm doing that is that I'll take it away, and you'll be able to hear that in making this boost at 4K, things are getting a little bit crispy, a little bit brittle, perhaps, because you've got the hi-hat and the snare in there. So I'm kind of, again, I'm playing one off against the other, and I'm sort of compensating for the fact that I'm boosting, and I'm also cutting at the same time to try and make the snare drum pop out a little bit more, but then soften things a little bit. So that's kind of the way you could approach EQing a single recording of a drum kit. You're going to maybe want to get a bit more punch out of the kick drum, a little bit more crack out of the snare drum. And then because I was making those boosts, it was necessary to attenuate some of the lows because that was making things a little bit muddy and a little bit woolly. And it was also necessary to attenuate the high end to compensate for the boost that I'd made for the snare drum. So this is just the nature of EQing something like a full drum kit that's all recorded on one track. You're not in a position where you are EQing the snare drum on its own and it's all about just that one part of the kit. You're EQing a signal which has got a range of frequencies from low to high. And so you just have to approach it in a slightly different way to how you would if you were EQing a multi-track recording of a drum kit. And so overall, I'm quite happy with that. So let's have a look at the compression. So I'll play you some of this and we'll start with the compressor off and then I'll switch it on. So all I'm really looking to do with this compressor is just to try and thicken things up a little bit, make things a little bit fatter. And the way I'm doing that is I'm using a pretty fast attack and release. Obviously, this is an 1176 style compressor, so it's a fast compressor anyway. And so I'm using a fast attack and a fast release to kind of grab the transients and kind of pull those down and then turn the output up to compensate. And so that gives us just a slightly fatter, a slightly thicker sound overall. Okay, and finally, let's add some reverb. So we'll start with the reverb off and then I'll turn it on. So with something like reverb, and obviously with EQ and compression as well, the way you're going to set these things is entirely dependent on what else you have going on in your mix. So, depending on the song, this might be a subtle reverb, or in some songs, this might be quite an obvious reverb. But what I'm doing here is I've got a fairly minimal decay. This is a chamber reverb, so I'm emulating having the mics quite close to the speakers, and the mix is quite low as well. So I'm just adding a touch of reverb to kind of make this sound a little bit more natural. Now you'll notice that I've taken away quite a bit of the low end for this reverb. The reason being, when you listen to the kick drum has quite a lot of kind of resonance to it to begin with. And I really didn't feel that there was any need to add any more. I think there's a lot of resonance coming from the room with this kick drum anyway. So the reverb is more focused on the high end, and I think it just adds a little bit of texture and a little bit of sort of a natural sound to the drum kit. So let's listen to the original recording. So I'll bypass all of the plugins and then we'll bring the plugins back in and we'll have a listen to what you could potentially create using just a single microphone recording of a drum kit. Now, you could certainly do a bit more refining of this track. You could work on the EQ a little more and the reverb and the compression, and you could make those things appropriate for the mix that you're working on. But I think this is a great starting point. Now, as I promised you, I'm going to give you 3 tips to get the best out of making this kind of recording. But while we're on the topic of EQ and compression, I have a free EQ and compression cheat sheet that you can download at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. The idea of these cheat sheets is to give you a really strong starting point on what frequencies to focus in on for different instruments and how to set your compressor to achieve things like punch and fatness out of different tracks. So if you want to take some of the guesswork out of EQ and compression, head over and get those free guides. Okay, so let's get into 3 tips, which I think are really kind of crucial to making this work when you record drums with just one microphone. And these are all tips that are concerned with actually capturing the original recording. So before you apply any compression or EQ or reverb, you've got to get the best recording that you can. These tips will help you do that. Now, the first thing is to make the drum kit sound as close to the way that you want it to sound on the recording as you can before you start recording. So there are kind of different schools of thought on this. Some drummers won't apply any dampening to their drum kit. They'll let the drums ring out, and the thought process there is that that gives you options when it comes to mixing, because if you want to shorten the length of the drums, you can use a gate, for example. The other school of thought on this is to kind of go to the opposite end and to make the drums sound as close as they possibly can to how you want them to sound when they're mixed. And in recent years, that's kind of the approach that I've adopted for each aspect of recording, no matter what it is that I'm recording. But that's particularly important when it comes to recording drums with one mic, because you don't have that level of control that you would have with a multi-track recording. And so the option to go in and gate drums isn't really available to you. And so what you want to do is you want to get the drums sounding as close as you can to how you want them to sound. And you do that in terms of the tuning, and you do that in terms of the dampening. So keep in mind, often if we record drums and we listen and we think, actually, that snare drum could have been tuned a little better, you still have some options, because you can EQ things and you can sometimes compensate if the snare drum's a little bit ringy, for example. Whereas when it comes to recording this way, yes, you still have options. You can still make those kinds of alterations, but you just have a little bit less flexibility. So spending some time making sure that the drum kit is really nicely tuned is important, and then spend some time on the dampening of the drum kit. And I find that generally you have to dampen the drums a little bit more than you would with a multi-track recording when you're recording with just one microphone. Now, the next tip that I'll give you, which I find really helps you to get the best recording that you can when you record this way, is to record in a dry room, or as dry as it possibly can be. Now, obviously, if we're working in home studio, project studio environments, we might not have the luxury of a lot of acoustic treatment, but if at all possible, you should take steps to make the room as kind of dry as it can be. And what I mean by that is that you reduce the natural reverb or the natural reflections that are occurring in the room as much as you possibly can. So adding things like carpets or rugs can help to reduce that reverberation and those reflections, because it's very easy to add reverb when you're mixing. It's a lot harder to take the reverb away or to reduce the reverb if you've captured too much of it on the recording. Now, the final tip that I'll give you, and this is perhaps the most important of the three, is that the performance that you give if you're the drummer, or that your drummer gives, should be intentional in terms of its dynamic range. So I talked earlier about getting a balanced sound from the drum kit, from each different part of the drum kit. And it really helps to keep that in mind when you're playing the take that you're recording. Obviously, I'm not saying that your take should lack feel or groove or dynamics, but it does have to be kept under control, because you don't have the option to turn different parts of the drum kit up or down in the way that you would with a multi-track recording. And so if the drummer is playing really heavily into the snare drum, but playing very lightly on the kick drum, chances are the kick drum is probably going to get lost when it comes to putting this drum recording into the context of a mix. And when I was recording the take that we've been listening to, I found it was necessary to play the hi-hat and the cymbals a bit lower than I normally would do, because again, it was just a little bit overpowering. And to try and turn hi-hats and cymbals down with a compressor, it's possible, but I think the best results come from getting a balanced take to begin with. Now, throughout this video, I've been mixing in Luna, and if you want to find out more about mixing songs in Luna, you can check out the video that's on screen now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.